if it's a substantial enough risk that it requires that kind of notification, why in the world is this drug on the market to begin with? But you're saying it was there for 20 years or 22 years without that warning. This is Generation Health. Every week we bring you the latest in news, cutting-edge research, and time-tested best practices, helping you live a longer, healthier life. Across from me, PharmD, board-certified clinical nutritionist, Joey DiMatteo. How are you, my friend?
Very good, sir.
And to my right, Dante DiMatteo, also a PharmD, certified strength and conditioning specialist. There's a bit of a mic stand between us. I'm sorry.
It's all right.
I don't need to see your face. You certainly don't need to see mine. Back behind mic number, 4, engineer extraordinaire, Josiah Schweinberg. How are you?
I'm well.
Excellent. This is so succinct. Everybody's being very pointed. My name is Tyler Andrews. I'm the host. And I guess we're just going to get right to it. Dante, what are we talking about?
We are talking about a risk of a particular asthma drug that has made its way to the headlines.
Yes.
And also the role of the FDA in that context.
Excellent. All right. First, what's happening behind the counter? We got a couple of really interesting news articles to share, things I'm excited about. A first in the smartwatch world. We did a whole episode about smartwatches. That was the first one in January, I think, of 2024. You guys should go watch it if you haven't. Samsung has announced that they have received authorization from the FDA to detect, track, and alert users about sleep apnea. Sleep apnea, aside from being difficult to say, is a medical condition in which a person's breathing becomes very shallow or stops altogether while they are asleep. Generally, the lack of oxygen causes people to wake up enough to move or readjust and start breathing again. Aside from being awful for rest, though, sleep apnea can have very serious side effects and lead to things like heart disease and strokes. 39 million Americans are estimated to be living with sleep apnea, but many of them don't actually know it, as diagnosing it requires special monitoring. And if you don't suspect it, you probably won't seek out those tests. All of that can change, though, with this authorization. Simply wearing an equipped Samsung smartwatch will allow the software to detect and identify the condition, which hopefully will mean that millions of people will seek the treatment that they need. Samsung is the first in the industry to have this authorization, but they certainly won't be the last. So if you have another device, stay tuned. I'm sure they'll have that coming up pretty soon. Very exciting. And great news. In just the first 2 weeks of 2024, drug makers raised prices on over 770 medications. But how is that good news, Tyler? Well, it's actually fewer than previous years, according to researchers who track these sorts of things. They said that in 2023, there were 1,425 drugs to get price hikes. And in 2022, that was 1,460. So this is down substantially. Different companies cited different factors as to why they're raising prices. Novo Nordisk blamed inflation. Eli Lilly gets points for honesty for saying it's because they base the value of their drugs on how they're selling and the value in the marketplace. So at least they're being honest about it. While the median increase was 4.5% over the last year, some prices did jump as much as 10%. And if you have prescription coverage, you probably won't notice that right away, but you can rest assured that those premiums will continue to rise through the year as to compensate for the increased costs. So, of course, if you don't have prescription coverage, though, you probably already know this. This isn't news for you at this point. So,
Novo Nordisk blaming inflation is incredible.
Well,
I don't doubt that.
Right.
You know, their costs, especially of transporting, etc. But yeah, that's laughable to me.
I like the honesty of no.
Exactly.
We adjust our prices based on the value in the marketplace, and we've increased value substantially, so we're adjusting our prices.
Demand is booming for those drugs.
It's true. It's true. Okay, so we've talked about that stuff. Dante, what are we talking about here? You said the Singulair, right? Is that the one we're talking about?
Yeah, Singulair or Montelukast is the generic name.
Okay. All right. Should I just start with the article here? That's probably the right thing to do.
I think that's good.
All right. New York Times reporting the New York Attorney General on Thursday, this is back a couple of weeks, urged the Food and Drug Administration to, quote, take immediate action and renew alerts to doctors and patients about the dangerous effects of Singulair for children, saying that the current warnings about the drug's psychiatric side effects were not sufficient. In a letter, the Attorney General, Letitia James, also called on the federal agency to consider discouraging the prescription of Singulair, an asthma and allergy drug, to children. Thousands of patients and parents have complained to the FDA about symptoms of anxiety, rage, hallucinations, and other psychiatric problems that they linked to the drug, which is also known in its generic form as
Montelukast.
There it is.
Guess. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's interesting because it is already in generic. This is not a brand new drug that we're talking about. Anyway, back to the article. Those reports, combined with an emotional FDA hearing in 2019 and cases cited in medical literature, led the FDA in 2020 to order its most stringent warning on instructions for the drug's usage. But an examination by the New York Times found that people continued to report that they were not aware of the possible side effects, which include suicide or suicide attempts when they took the medicine or gave it to their children. Ms. James cited the Times article and called on the FDA, quote, to implement new, more stringent safety regulations for the drug, unquote, particularly for children. Quote, parents and guardians have the same right to be fully informed of a medication's potential side effects when making choices about their children's health. Ms. James said in a statement on Thursday, quote, the risks associated with taking Singulair are far too dire to come without a very clear warning. The rest of that article will be in the show notes, so if you want to read that, you can do so. This is a big deal. I mean, sounds horrifying and terrifying. What exactly are the warnings that we need to know about first?
The black box warnings that they're referring to, and we can talk a little bit more about what that means exactly. But in general, what they're referring to is you're just talking about the neuropsychiatric events, or are you talking about the actual, what is a black box warning?
Well, we can get into that. I had that down there just a little bit. I meant specifically, what is it they're freaking out? What is it that people need to know about beyond the hype of the article?
So there definitely appears to be an increased risk in these neuropsychiatric side effects, especially in younger populations who have asthma or chronic allergies who are taking this medication.
Yeah. So it's not just nonsense. There is some actual track record here that we're talking about.
There is. And in the package insert, it refers to them again as the neuropsychiatric events. And, it alludes to the fact that it can occur in adults and adolescents, as well as pediatric patients. And the post-marketing reports with Singulair use include agitation, aggressive behavior or hostility, anxiousness, depression, disorientation, dream abnormalities, hallucinations, insomnia, irritability, restlessness, somnambulism or sleepwalking.
Yeah.
Suicidal thinking and behavior, as you mentioned, and tremor. So just a little bit more of a comprehensive picture of all the possible things that have been reported.
Just a little bit. That's a few side effects.
That's a long list. That's scary.
My goodness. How
common are these side effects? I mean, if those are the realistic possibilities, especially for youths, is it worth taking this drug?
This will all boil down to an individual, cost benefit analysis,
right?
For the lack of a better description, between family or patient and the provider.
Yeah.
There's certainly going to be instances where maybe you start this and it's not working that well anyway. And aside from side effects, you probably just want to move on to something else. But the problem is it does work pretty well.
Yep.
It's fairly inexpensive
for its intended purpose.
Right. And it is fairly inexpensive at this point. But looking way back to answer your question, even at some of these early clinical trials, there was a very low risk of these neuropsychiatric side effects. That initial trial, I think there was one person in total that stopped taking the med because of anxiety symptoms.
Okay.
Now, what occurred in the 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, 12 years after taking it, I was unsure, at what sort of follow-up there was done on
Sure.
that particular cohort. But again, in general, it's not that it wasn't reported. It was just occurring at such a low percentage. And then again, it takes time, it takes a lot of post-market surveillance to see how some of these things sort of flesh out. And even in some of the current forward-looking studies, the incidence rates are still generally, it seems like less than 1%.
Oh, wow.
But, I saw there was one statistic that out of the 12 million people taking Singulair in the US, 1.6 million people are children. So, you're talking about a generally high absolute amount of people, even though it is a low percentage.
Right. Exactly. That's the risk is very low, it seems like, but that is small consolation for anybody that's dealing with this.
Mm-hmm.
I think one thing that you touched on that's interesting, Singulair was approved as a brand medication in 1998, went generic in 2012. This black box warning didn't come until 2020.
Yeah.
So it just underscores the importance of long-term monitoring. One study I found from 2022, so even a couple years after the black box warning, 72,490 patients with asthma, and also 82,000 with allergic rhinitis were evaluated for neuropsychiatric outcomes. It's called the odds ratio. So basically, how many more people get this? The outcome that they're looking at, in this case, the side effect, was 1.1 in patients with asthma,
Okay.
1.11. So that's an 11%. If you are taking the medication, you have 11% higher rate of having this outcome than a normal. Yes. So it was 1.11% in asthma, 1.07%. So it's technically a fancy way of saying 7% more likely in allergic rhinitis. They did find that anxiety was the most common, 1.21. So a 21% more likely outcome there for you. And then insomnia was second, 1.15. So that's a pretty large, long-term, study. And again, sometimes with this, these are statistical facts, but how you slice it, I think Dante touched on an important point of what's the absolute number, what's the percentage of those people.
Right.
Because when you say, well, there's an 11% higher chance, it can be, it really just depends. Even statistical facts can kind of be sliced up, depending on how you view them and how they're presented. And that's where headlines can be very grabbing, et cetera. So it's,
yeah. If I had an 11% chance of winning the lottery, I would be playing every single day.
Mm-hmm.
That's fast. Okay. So you mentioned and the article mentioned box warning or black box warning. What is that specifically?
In general, it's just the FDA's way of assigning the highest safety related warning to a medication possible in a simple sense. So, in the, whether the drug's already on the market or it's currently being developed, they can say, hey, you have to put this sort of messaging in the package insert, has to be dispensed with a medication guide, those sorts of things that essentially just call attention to something like increased risk or likelihood of neuropsychiatric issues.
Right. Because it doesn't people don't normally jump to, I'm taking an allergy med, therefore maybe my insomnia is caused by that, or my depression or anxiety. That's not, if you're taking a psychiatric med, it makes sense that would play in that circuitry.
Yeah. And I think even just in general, whenever you look at something like this, I don't know, like you're saying, you're not as likely to look for those type of side effects.
Yeah.
You're dealing with asthma, you're looking at things tangential or obviously immediately related to how these medications work, how medications that are used for that, like glucocorticoids, prednisone, et cetera, you're kind of looking, comparing in that world.
Right.
And this one is kind of out of the blue. And I think one other important thing though, to wrap up, box warnings, they can be added when a drug initially goes on the market. They can be taken away over time and they can be updated later. So I think it's just crucial to remember that black box warnings, they're technically called box warnings, but they're kind of always framed in black, and they stand out from side effects, because you can get one of those drug guides and side effect lists and print out from your pharmacist, look it up. There's going to be side effects listed, and they want this one to stand out. So again, it is, like Dante said, it's the highest warning. And then again, what's critical to me is the fluidity of it, that it can be taken away, added. Again, 22 years after this drug was first approved and 10 years after it went generic, a black box warning was added.
Wow.
Yeah. And the thing with boxed warnings too is that there's over 400 medications right now that have boxed warnings. And so that's a lot.
That is a lot.
It is a lot. But in general, what they will often do when assigning these warnings, let's say there was 10 drugs with the same mechanism as Singulair, they would generally apply that same warning across all the other 9.
Even if they haven't necessarily tested and confirmed it with each of the others, because it's the same mechanism, they just say, nope, it's all getting it.
From my understanding, oftentimes these warnings are class specific.
Okay.
So.
And I guess what you just said about 400 drugs, that makes sense, because in my mind, I'm going, if it's a substantial enough risk that it requires that kind of notification, why in the world is this drug on the market to begin with? But you're saying it was there for 20 years or 22 years without that warning.
And there's a clear distinction with the, as scary as they kind of make the boxed warning sound, they don't frame them as absolute contraindications. It's just an extra layer of what should theoretically be, hey, your pharmacist brings this up to you, your physician brings this up to you, the person checking you out at your pharmacy brings this up to you. It's something to fill in all these gaps. Whereas what we're alluding to with this entire thing is that there were many gaps, clearly for some patients who weren't expecting this.
Yeah. How is it? I mean, I guess if there was in the clinical trials, you said there was only one person that actually reported anything like this. How is it that it went 22 years without getting noticed?
I think part of this too is, again, I know you kind of said, well, why was this drug allowed on the market? I think that's what's critical here is, what do you want the FDA to do?
Right.
If you want them to be this iron fist and not allow these drugs to go to market, I'm not minimizing that one person, but when you've got 100 people, this is for asthma. I mean,
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, this is, you can deal with longer term remodeling of your airways with poorly treated asthma. It's a very serious condition.
Yeah.
So I think that, to me, in the big picture sense, and this is not, the FDA is incredible and amazing and perfect by any means. It's just that fluidity to me is the key, to come back to that term. That it's not, well, once we approve it, now we have to back it up and we're going to stand behind it. And they're almost motivated then to defend what they've done. No, it's a situation where, hey, we can add this warning, we can take this away over time, because no matter how much they test them, time is the one thing that can't be controlled when you're looking at 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road.
Sure.
So that's what gives me some comfort. Yes, it's alarming that in 2020 this was added.
Yeah.
But thank God it was added.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point.
You know what I mean? It really depends how you look at it. Again, fluidity to me is the key here, that it's continually evaluated. And this is something maybe we can touch on later, but I think what's also really important is report these things.
Yeah.
Not just like tag them on Twitter and write a nasty letter. Report them to Medwatch. Just Google FDA Medwatch. If you've dealt with something like this or any of these drugs, these side effects, especially the more serious they are, report them. That's where these things get rolling.
Mm-hmm. And that's a good point about Medwatch too. That's essentially just the program that the FDA uses as a way to compile and track all of these adverse effects. And so, I mean, you could literally sign up for notifications just for, hey, a medication gets added, or there's these million reports coming out on this particular thing. And I just like to stay in the know. My parents are on 20 medications, and you never know. I want to know about recalls, and I want to know about these sorts of things. They do make that generally accessible. And then even going one step further to something like Medwatch, and not to jump too far ahead, and I know that Joey might have something to add here too, is that what this sounds like is that the Singulair thing is potentially on track to something a little more complex, something referred to as a REMS program medication.
Okay. What is that?
And so REMS just stands for Risk Evaluation in Mitigation Strategies. And now REMS is sort of just the overarching umbrella of these different steps that can be taken to prevent these issues from occurring, or, maybe making access to these medications intentionally a little more difficult. But the one example that comes to mind is something called iPledge. And so for medications like Accutane or isotretinoin, which has a known risk to cause issues with pregnancy and, passing on, or ending up with birth defects and that sort of thing, which is very serious. So essentially the prescriber has to be signed up with this iPledge program. The patient has to be signed up with this program. The pharmacy has to be signed up. The insurance is involved. So a prescription for that medication can't just be sent to a pharmacy and processed without the patient having certain tests done, the office knowing how to conduct those tests, the pharmacy verifying that those tests were done. The pharmacy can't place the order for the medication until all those other things are met. So it's just that it's maybe people are thinking like, what in the heck happens with Singulair?
Right.
There's a chance that given how all of this is going, maybe this isn't as serious. You hate to say that, but the point is there's always a step further with these strategies.
I guess the pushback is that 99% of people benefit from taking this medication, or at least don't have this serious adverse side effect. So we don't stop helping the 99% because of the risk to the 1%. The big takeaway seems to be that you need to be an informed consumer. And that's what a box warning is about. In addition to your doctor telling you these things, your pharmacist pointing these things out, but that the box warning is to point out, if you haven't noticed it already, hey, there's this thing you need to be watching out for just in case.
Absolutely. And I think, what do we talk about so much? And it's so basic, but to me, it just underlies so much of what we talk about. The scale, the risk reward. So for example, asthma, how serious asthma can be.
Yeah.
The bar is a little different, maybe a little lower for needing to take that medication. What else is this drug approved for? Allergic rhinitis. I'm not, again, minimizing how uncomfortable allergic rhinitis is. It's especially, when you deal with allergens, seasonal, hay fever, pollen dust, mold, those kind of things. But knowing this, and you have a child, maybe the bar, if it's the same drug, but the bar for allergic rhinitis is different than the bar for asthma to me.
Makes sense.
Further, if you have a family history of psychiatric issues, even anxiety, let alone depression, more serious things, God forbid, suicidal thoughts and ideations, the bar changes there too. Yes, it's for asthma. Yes, my child has asthma, but boy, I have a family history of this. The concern changes. So I think that's what's critical too, is just knowing, and then you adjust your scales based on what your situation may be. They did find that there was an increased rate in patients with no psychiatric history, but it still can occur, but it's definitely increased.
Okay.
Increased odds.
Yeah.
It seems like the FDA is kind of in a tough spot here. They've already applied the box warning, which is the most stringent notification warning that they put on a med. It's been out for 20 something years at this point. It's generic. It's helping millions of people. What is it they're supposed to do? You said, what was it called? The REMS program?
The REMS program. Yes.
So that's a possibility. Is there anything else they can do?
So in that Attorney General's letter, I mean, there was a call to action on a few different things. And I think that highlights, some of the options. They want the New York Attorney General's office essentially called for them to issue a new drug safety communication, stating basically like the FDA is doing something about this. Like they're launching an official investigation. They're looking more closely at clinical trials. Like they need somebody to go in deep on a lot of this data. Very similar to what was happening with the phenylephrine. They did a deep dive on all the existing evidence and said, all right, we're going to figure out whether or not we need to come to a consensus on this.
Right.
You know what I mean? We got all these reports. We got all this stuff. We've been working on this for years. Let's get the epidemiologists on this and figure out what the data really says. And then the second thing is ultimately just sending out like a PSA. They call it a Dear Healthcare Provider letter to all chains of command. So this is physicians' offices, pharmacists, other healthcare providers, almost just as like a starting from scratch sort of thing. Here's this drug. Here's how it works. Here's what can happen. Take a look at your patients. Take a look at everything. We're time to look at this a little more objectively. they also kind of take it one step further in calling for them to essentially, I'll just read what they said, conduct a review of all available information to determine whether the risk from use of montelukast clearly outweighs any therapeutic benefit in children and warrants a contraindication warning that it should not be used in children under 18. And so, in looking at the data one step further, saying, are we at the point where we might be able to say that in this subset of the population that maybe
that the
it
risk is too great.
It is a contraindication. And then lastly, like you said, was that kind of final step. Let's look at one of these more, look at imposing one of these more stringent, multi-level, complex REMS strategies that just makes it harder to acquire the drug, dispense the drug, and the patient start taking it essentially.
Okay.
So it's a lot. I mean, the FDA,
that's what the Attorney General is asking for.
Sure.
They have those things as possibility. So this is not the first time this sort of thing has happened. It's not like they're looking for some brand new governmental agency or something to be created.
Right.
These sorts of steps already exist because these things have happened in the past.
Mm-hmm.
What's the deal with that? Are there other things we need to know about from the past that point to this?
The big one that I remember even learning about in pharmacy school is thalidomide.
Okay.
So
I've never heard of that.
So thalidomide was we can get into that, but thalidomide caused birth defects, very severe birth defects.
I assume that wasn't what they advertised it as.
Correct. Yes. And what was particularly problematic was that it was used for kind of morning sickness, nausea in women.
Oh, wow.
So pregnant women, obviously, most likely to have that symptom.
Yeah.
Most effect, you're trying to sell a drug, bang for your buck, how it's marketed, etc. So then obviously that was, devastating impact. Late 50s, early 60s where this occurred. Essentially it was shortening of limbs. It was, very serious physical birth defects with that. So there are some layers to it. I mean, they estimate that 20,000 patients in the US had taken this drug at that time. But I think what's critical to understand, and again, this is not like to turn it into like defending the FDA, is that it was not approved here. This is, and again, there's multiple layers here, but it was an unregulated clinical trial that was kind of funneled, through because the drug was developed in Europe. So the medication was used there. That's where most of the impact was seen. Obviously, any impact with something like this is dramatic, but there are estimates that 6 to 17 babies were born here with that birth defect. There were thousands born overseas.
Wow.
So I believe it was a German drug that was developed. And then, so that this was obvious. This is the one that stands out in terms of also what it led to, which in a nutshell was that in 1962, regulations and power and authority of the FDA to screen for the safety of drug and also just public awareness of new drugs was, there was an act. It was an amendment to the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And that was, again, critical in the process of drug approval that, we keep improving, hopefully, as we go on today.
So prior to that, safety wasn't really part of their purview in terms of drug analysis?
Not to the extent.
Okay.
Within the amendments, they laid out more specific plans about how the drug will be approved and also marketed. Further, so yes, in a broad sense, safety, yes. But what do you do with that? If you're not told, if you're a drug company, you're not told you have to do X, Y, Z. I hate to say it. Especially before a lot of these awful incidents occurred, you're going to do kind of the minimum to get your drug to market, and it works and it's fine. And
it worked in Europe. Why won't it work here?
Right. Yeah. And I think what was critical too is in that same amendment, pregnancy categories were created. So they could, essentially categorize them by the effect on pregnant women and also the reproduction. Has it been shown to be effective, studied in pregnant women? Is it more ambiguous, somewhere in between? That was a critical outcome of this as well.
So because of thalidomide, the FDA was able to have some stronger teeth in its enforcement end of things. I seem to remember there being a thing in the early aughts, Vioxx, a pharmaceutical that came to market and then went away. And I don't remember exactly why. I just remember hearing it on the news all the time. What was that about?
So it was just basically another NSAID like ibuprofen.
Okay.
That was marketed as a safer alternative to help with pain, osteoarthritic pain, basically. Okay. And it was later found that it had an increased risk of cardiovascular disease in a pretty short amount of time after somebody was taking it.
Oh, goodness.
So
okay.
It sparked a whole issue, or sparked an entire cascade of legal issues, of course.
Yeah.
And, certainly left a lasting impact on this part of the industry.
Is the correction of that also based out of some of the things that were learned from thalidomide? And is that kind of what we're using now with the Singulair debate?
I would say sort of, just more in relation to the way clinical trials and such are structured now. It has much more to do with that, and just the rigor that's required to make sure you're actually coming up with legitimate data. But I want to say that Merck they actually voluntarily pulled this from the market.
Okay.
So if they weren't going to do it, it was going to get pulled at some point, but
right.
I believe they make it known that, we saw this starting to occur. We pulled it from the market.
And when did that hit the market? When did Vioxx come out?
So that would have been late 90s, like 1998, 1999.
So around the same time as Singulair.
I guess technically, yeah.
Interestingly, yeah.
Yeah.
And these drugs are important in the sense that they are, I don't want to say new versions, but they're tweaked versions of NSAIDs that we commonly use, like ibuprofen and naproxen.
Okay.
So one major issue is with those types of meds are GI issues. So you can have everything from just intestinal distress through GI bleeds. So it's because I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but COX-1 and COX-2. COX-1 is involved in platelet aggregation, also the lining of your stomach.
Okay.
Ibuprofen and naproxen blocked COX-1 and 2. So they developed these drugs, Celebrex and Vioxx, right around the same time. Celebrex was 98, Vioxx was 99, that only work on COX-2. So only work theoretically on the inflammatory pain. So it was meant as an improvement of these drugs.
Sure, yeah.
And one thing in a broad sense of where, like Dante touched on some of the studies and the data that was gathered was, the Merck developed Vioxx in response to these GI issues and these GI bleeds. So they studied the drug compared to naproxen relative to GI bleeds. That's where the focus was. Other information, depending on what your view is or how controversial you want to get, was hidden or twisted.
Yeah.
And so again, it was really the target. Like we kind of touched on with the Singulair. Whenever you're looking at this indication, this disease state, the medications used for that disease state, and you're in that world, sometimes you can miss what's over here.
Yeah. And
even though they kind of should have known, and there were definitely some indicators in the study, even from a mechanism standpoint, how this can occur, how the cardiovascular events could have occurred, the target, the marketing, the money, the research was behind. Let's compare it to peptic ulcers, basically.
Sure. Okay, man. But it does seem like we are learning as we go. And improving this process. I mean, pharmacy is only in the modern sense, 100 years old, and there are major safety precautions and steps and pathways put in to protect the consumer, while also making sure that the industry is able to keep producing these miraculous drugs that do incredible things. What else do consumers need to know, whether it's about Singulair or box warnings or anything like that? What's the big takeaway from an episode like this?
I think for me, it still comes down to there's such a tendency all the time, but especially nowadays, that this drug is bad, this drug is evil, the FDA is bad, the FDA is great, and you're in this box of one or the other. And I think, to me, I keep coming back to the fluidity of this.
Yeah.
If you're on these drugs, you put it on the scale and you balance in terms of what you're using it for, what the side effects could be. Be aware, though. Advocate for yourself. Be aware, at least, especially with those black box warnings. Just be aware of what's out there, your history, propensity, and just be aware of them. To me, that's really the main thing. And again, back to the FDA thing, is just to maintain the fluidity that they can not be in a position to defend what they approved or what they initially labeled, but that they are motivated to change them when warranted.
That makes sense.
And in doing that, it requires doctors, pharmacists, patients to report these events so that when they can see groups of them and big pockets of them, that something can actually be done about it. If they don't know, the FDA doesn't know, they can't do anything.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. So the informed consumer is the punchline. Mm-hmm. You have to take responsibility for your own health.
Mm-hmm. It really is a tough communication balance to strike, between the person who's a potential candidate for the medication like this and the provider. You walk into the office and they're discussing this potential option with you, and it's, hey, this is a really good option.
Yeah.
This helps a ton of people with symptoms, and no more inhaled steroids. Like, you can just try one of these and you're good. And then all of a sudden they say, but there's this black box warning, so, and it has this scary appeal. So it's the clinician is also not trying to scare or deter somebody from pursuing an option. It's, how do you put that out there without it, on the flip side, scaring you from doing literally anything. So It is tough. Maybe there's an issue with the language of boxed warnings and black box warnings that has seemingly emerged over time. Maybe that's an issue, but to sort of crystallize that thought, I would say that, when you leave the pharmacy and you're picking up a medication for the first time for yourself or for your kid, the proclivity is to just throw those papers away that, list the hundreds of side effects.
I have done that.
And all the issues, which again is completely normal. It feels like a waste of paper for us half the time, unfortunately, in the pharmacy. Yeah. But again, when it's your first couple times, look for that black box, look for the boxed warnings, have a feel for some of those more glaring issues. You don't have to read the entire thing cover to cover, because a lot of it is overkill. It's like the commercial thing where there's it lists all these things. And but again, just have a feel for some of these, larger issues. Again, what we say, there's over 400 medications with boxed warnings. You're not going to be an expert on all 400 of those.
Right.
But again, I'm sure there's somebody in your family that there's maybe a total of 10 meds that you might have a familiarity with as far as some of these warnings go. It's just maybe a cluing somebody to just pay a little more attention to those things. And for us too. And if you're from a counseling standpoint,
if it's for a minor, you should definitely ask if there's anything you should be watching out for, because as an adult, hopefully you'll notice, hey, I just started taking this medicine and now I'm having really weird dreams. I wonder if those are associated. Yeah, you'll probably figure that out. But with a child, they may not have any way to communicate
exactly that. And Dante brought up a great point, I think, is the communication with your pharmacist, with your doctor about this, because again, we're still mainly concerned about this mainly in children, in adolescence. What's occurring in children and adolescents? Mood changes.
Right.
And so you're looking at depression, anxiety, sleep disturbances, suicidal thoughts in a population that's like changing like crazy. So now, again, you're going to have everybody, I'm on Singulair, these things are occurring. Well, let's really try to talk about what's going on potentially, that maybe it's not related to Singulair. But that's what, again, on a national perspective, when these things are being properly reported, then hopefully people who can better evaluate these things on a large scale can maybe kind of pin down where this is coming from. But the communication is critical. That's a great point.
Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense.
I glossed over this. Nearly 20% of children aged 3 through 17 have a mental, emotional, developmental, or behavioral condition. And of those children, 40% do not receive treatment or counseling. And so what we're talking about, again, to really hammer this home, is that we're already dealing with a population quite susceptible to these issues. And it's worth paying the extra attention to what's maybe in your med guide.
For sure.
And still communicating properly. Because again, 20% are dealing with it. So now you're a mom or a dad and you read this headline, my kid's on Singulair. Oh my God, this drug is getting back to what I said initially. This is a bad drug. This is a terrible drug. Get off this. This is horrible. Well, let's take this piece by piece. What's going on where we can help our child with both of these things without necessarily throwing the baby out with the bathwater, getting rid of the Singulair for something that may not be causing it.
So informed consumer, just be aware, know your situation, talk to your doctor, talk to your pharmacist. Makes sense.
Informed decisions. It's almost as if that's how this show all started with Senior.
He sure did. That's exactly correct. And if you want to hear any of those original shows, you can find them on our website, askjoedimatteo.com. That's askjoedimatteo.com. That site is also where you can sign up for our newsletter to find out about sales. Sales on what? Oh, well, that'd be sales on the supplements that we sell on our website. Things like omegas and red yeast rice that I take and protein and all sorts of fun stuff. All of that's available on our website, askjoedimatteo.com. Sign up for the email, find past episodes of this show, past episodes of the original show, Ask Joe DiMatteo, all there on the website. If you have any questions, we want to hear about them. Questions at askjoedimatteo.com is the email address to send them to. And show notes, anything that we referenced, including we're going to have the Medwatch link down in the show notes of this show. So if you want to read any of the articles, they'll be available. We're not trying to hide anything. We want you guys to do your own research. Be an informed consumer. Big thank you, as always, to Josiah Schweinberg, our engineer, Joyce Gibb, the nurse practitioner, Michael Deppish, our editor, Diane Silverman, who manages our product, Terry, who does scheduling, Cecilia does distribution. That's Dante DiMatteo. That's Joey DiMatteo. I'm Tyler Andrews. And if you enjoyed this, if you learned something, give the show a thumbs up or a 5-star rating. More than anything else, though, share it with somebody you know. Almost certain somebody in your life is probably taking a medication with a box warning, and they should probably know what that's about and how to navigate those waters. So share it with somebody, and that helps us out too. Thanks so much. We will see you guys again next time.